All right. Everybody having a good time? Okay. Well, you all know him very well. He is our technical director and founder of id Software, responsible for the mega texture technology you've seen in ETQW and just about every rendering, engine that it has ever done. John Carmack.
Okay, most of you know the drill here. I get up and I'll ramble for an hour about whatever I feel like, and then I'll take questions for pretty much as long as anybody still has anything to ask here. So, the normal topics are the platforms that we have to work on, the challenges that we have developing for it, the trends and the way things have been changing since the early days, and the evolutionary directions that I think things are still going in. And I think the most important thing to look at is to still just really be thankful and appreciative about how wonderful the industry and the things that we do here really are. I mean, we've got a pace of change and evolution that is really just not seen anywhere else. The things that used to be really, really hard are now just done routinely. The things that used to be impossible are now fairly easy. And the things that used to be unthinkable are the things that we work on as problems in our day-to-day development work here. So the PC space development is still, we're carrying on our internal development project, which we're still not talking about, simultaneously working towards 360 and PS3 development, hopefully simultaneous release on that. And I'm hoping that pretty soon, certainly by next QuakeCon, we'll be able to talk about what we're doing on there. But I'm pretty proud of the development team in that we are, in this time, actually sticking to one of the early maxims that we try to do, where we want to focus on the game rather than focusing on necessarily the visual tactics that we're using in there. And every development project for the last, at least 3, we start out saying this is what we want to do. We want to block it out, make sure the gameplay is good, so we have the freedom to change things without committing so much resources to it. And every time we fail. We go out, and as soon as some new technology comes in, the artists start making something that looks really cool, the level designers feel compelled to match that level of coolness throughout all the different levels, and they wind up with something where they've spent a month very carefully tweaking this thing, and we then later find out, well, this isn't a good idea, we need to knock a hole in this and slide this over. And we've done pretty good this project so far, where we have not spent so much time on the lavish things where we go make the showpieces that we're desperate to show to the world, to show off how cool and awesome our new stuff is. We are focusing on sort of the long-term prospects of the plan, where we've got all this work that needs to be done in the AI and game development side of things. We're plenty confident that visually it's going to come out, it's going to be stunning, it's going to be something that people look at as a new benchmark for all next-gen consoles and high-end PC platforms and all that. I mean, we don't want to take it as a foregone conclusion, because we're still working hard on all that. But we have decided that the more important things for us to focus on are making sure that the whole game can get done, can solve all the other things that it has to do, as well as still having the traditional id value in graphics engine and multiplayer play and things like that. So the platform-wise, it's been pretty much as I said last year. Most of this still carries through, where the 360 is an excellent development platform. The PS3 is likely somewhat marginally more powerful, but more difficult to develop for. But again, it's an embarrassment of riches. The space that we've got to work with now, consoles have pretty much all the positive developments that PCs had in terms of the development environments, flexibility that you can use in developing for them, as well as having their own inherent advantages of not having this broad, mushy spectrum of resources and requirements that the PCs have on there. So that's been interesting. We are still probably somewhat more so focused on the PC. Most of the development still gets done on the PC, with testing done on the 360s, but we're able to keep it up to date fairly easily between there. And I don't expect any huge issues going forward in there. The PS3 is going to be a little bit more of a challenge, as we have to sort of refactor some of the code to hope to take advantage of the cell processors. And that's sort of leading into what I think is going to be the biggest topic for high-end development, at least, going forward. And that's how we're going to be taking advantage of parallelism. And it's a much harder problem than a lot of people give it credit for, where it's easy to go in and take a kernel of something and take advantage of multiple processors. It's a focused problem. And there's a lot of little things that we do where we can just go ahead and say, oh, render bump needs to get faster. Let's go split it up and run it on multiple processors, and this is an easy speed up. But when we look at an entire game and say, all right, enemy territory on the 360 is really going to be hurting with 20 players or something in there, going ahead and saying, well, we've got 3 processors and 6 threads, let's just divide all of this up. And it totally doesn't work like that. And there's a lot of different strategies that people can undertake for this, and we're going to be investigating really all of these in the coming years, because parallel acceleration is not a solved problem. And it's not really like the situation with a lot of graphics, where we have clear things that we can point to in the evolution of graphics towards the high end, where you can look at offline rendering and film rendering and say, games will be approaching this. We'll be taking different tacks to get there. We won't use the same structures or internal algorithms necessarily, but it's a clear path. We have an existence proof. Things will get better and better until they start looking like the movies in the real-time games. But with a lot of the problems that we're undertaking in games now, physics simulation is also definitely one of those things where there's plenty of research done on this, but it's not to the point where you can say, this is a solved problem, this is the right way to do it, this is the way all the important commercial applications do it. There's still a lot of experimentation and trial and error and different things where you wind up getting benefits in some cases that don't wind up scaling to more complicated problems, or you run into sort of hidden reefs that you weren't expecting with that. And I think while there's a fair amount of people that are cautious about this, if anything, I expect the industry to be surprised at the challenges and difficulties of really trying to exploit this. There's definitely the easy things that you wind up doing where audio people are going to be really happy as we get multiple cores, multiple processors on the consoles, where it's going to be easy to just say, okay, the audio guy gets an entire CPU all to themselves. And that's one of those things where that's an easy, obvious choice, and games will get somewhat better for it. Although I would say that I'm certainly in the graphics geek category, and I come down a little bit. I don't think that there are huge, incredible benefits to be gained by throwing lots of processing in audio. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that I think audio doesn't have huge gains for gaming in general, just that the sophisticated algorithms that people talk about using full processors and DSPs for on audio, I somewhat question the real benefit that you get out of that in the game. Now, the audio designer is an incredibly important part of the experience, but the tools that you give them, whether it's just simple volume-based mixing and spatialization, just really trivial algorithms, versus if you give them these incredibly detailed head models with frequency domain synthesis of all sorts of different things and procedural sound synthesis, all this type of stuff that you can do, and there are useful reasons in some cases to do these, but I don't think they quite carry their weight relative to a lot of other things that you could throw a programmer at in gaming. I do come back to, I've been several times over the years now, I've been in the position of having to pick up the sound engine when we had a programmer that was working on sound code that left the company. And I had to do that for the original Quake 1 and then later for Doom 3. And in both cases, the original game model had sophisticated pretensions about what it was going to be doing, and it set out to do sophisticated things. And we would be left in a position where nobody was really happy with what the sound engine was doing. You could make some neat demos of a particular effect going on, but it wasn't a rock-solid tool. And when I was kind of called in emergency mode to go fix the sound code, I went in and I basically ripped out all of the fancy special stuff and just made a really rock-solid, reliable, basic, functional engine. And everybody was really much happier in both cases with that. Which is not to say that it's not possible to have an absolutely rock-solid, highly functional engine that does all of this fancy stuff. But we had a couple perfect test cases. There are cases where, given what people were used to with fancy stuff and not necessarily completely reliable, versus simpler stuff that still did what turned out to be the really important things, that turned out to be kind of the right direction to go. Now, as game development budgets get larger and larger, then you wind up having one really good programmer dedicated to sound, or a few programmers dedicated to that, and you're going to get excellent results, and you can get all of that. But my point would still be that I think that the benefit that you're going to get out of that will not be something that really draws someone from one game to the other. It will be the type of thing where if you have two games that are otherwise comparable, you might be able to make a little bit of a case for really fancy high-end sound synthesis on one. But if the other game has anything more powerful going for it, that's going to win out. So throwing a CPU at sound, not a bad idea. You'll get some benefit from it, and honestly, in the early days, we're going to have CPUs, or at least threads, almost sitting around idle. So that's a clear and obvious direction to go. The other direction that we've been taking in Quake 3, Quake 4 timeframe is coarse-grained pipelining, where you take the game code, essentially running it in one thread, and then the renderer, part of the renderer, running in another thread. And in the Quake games, we only ran off kind of the back end of the renderer, not the entire front end doing the animation and things like that. So it limited to some degree the acceleration benefits you could get. And to a large degree, it just became what fed the graphics driver. And we had, at some points on some platforms, we were seeing 40% speed ups in some cases. But it turned out to be what's going to be a recurring theme with multiplayer or multiprocessor acceleration, fairly fragile, where we had all of these cases where through no changes on our part, they would start or stop working on different driver revisions or different point releases, and things that should have had no impact on it whatsoever. But just because there were these multiple things running, it brought up problems that that we otherwise weren't seeing in the single-player games. And this was with extremely conservative use of multi-threaded resources on there, where it was all architected to completely minimize the amount of communication that it might have, the tasks that it might throw at the hardware or the operating system on there, and we still ran into all of these problems. It is true that on console, you can avoid a lot of that because you really are in control, much more so, although not completely down to the bit level nowadays because you do still have APIs in most cases to go through. But on the PC, doing a really aggressive multimedia application that's seriously threaded, it might be stable today, but it wasn't the type of thing where when we were shipping Doom 3, I made the early decision that I did not think it was going to be stable at the time of Doom 3's release, and I didn't want to make a major feature of something that we didn't think that everybody could reliably run. Previously, we've always had the S&P acceleration be something that we consider a hardcore novelty, maybe, where we don't say on the box S&P acceleration, where if you say it on the box, it's expected to work. We can put it out and let people play with it, and if they happen to have the right configuration and things are working right, they can reap some benefit from it, and that's a good thing. But I was not comfortable at the time of Doom 3 of making something that we could rely on and count on. Now, for our current project, we are absolutely expecting multi-processor acceleration for the consoles, and we do think that it's finally reliable and robust enough on the PC that we will expect major PC SKUs to go ahead and be running the S&P acceleration nodes on there. But of course that winds up with, you've got the situation where the PCs might not need to do that directly because the PC processors are at least twice as fast as the console processors anyways. But as we look forward on there, there's going to be this coarse-grained time frame in for the next, certainly this console generation, where we're dealing with small interval number of processors, whether it's 3 or 4 or 8. In that range, the type of parallelism that works out well for a complex task does tend to be pipeline level parallelism. And there's a lot of good analogies that you can make to the way processors have worked and evolved. Where early on, when processors were just these big synchronous lumps on there going through multiple cycles per iteration, that would sort of be the analogy of the way single-threaded games are now. It's doing a complex act that may have lots of communication around in what it's doing, but you can start trying to break this up into pieces and then run them concurrently. And it's not a trivial thing to do. You have a lot more information that you need to buffer between stages. You wind up with all of the things that processors have done, with all of these bypasses and feed-forwards and feedbacks and branch predictions and things like that that we'll start to have software analogies for if we want to get more layers of acceleration. Where right now we're essentially setting it up for the 2 layers of pipelining the entire renderer on one thread, including a lot of the generation of different models and things like that, not just the feeding of the APIs, and then leaving one processor strictly for the game code. But that's, like in a game like Enemy Territory, the game code has a whole lot of bottlenecks in it. You can take up a whole lot of processing time doing that. So we really need to be looking forward to how we can start accelerating those operations. And there is no clear path from the code structures that we've got right now. And in fact, I think that would be a wonderful little research project for some people to take some of the existing code and try and take existing game code and accelerate it over multiple processors, like run it on either a larger number of very slow processors so you don't have to change the data sets, or somehow scale the game up to many more things on there. And I think it's likely that we can get another stage or two of parallelism by separating some of the game logic into sort of a sense the environment and then think about and react to how you want to do it, and so that we could maybe then go ahead and evenly spread across 3 processors on there. And I think that's a likely direction, but it's going to be something that we have to sit down and do some little research on before our next development project. And things like that make it even worse for architectures like the Cell, where at least on the 360 you have 3 symmetrical processors, which any one of them can run the same code, they're in the same address space, and you can set up pretty nice structures to go ahead and you've got a lot of freedom for it. When you've got asynchronous multiprocessing rather than symmetric multiprocessing, or asymmetric rather than symmetric, you've got the situation where you have to think about them more as acceleration engines rather than processors that you're working with. So you do still have the one main thread that goes through and does everything, and then you try and parcel out tasks for the different accelerators to work on. And there's obvious cases where so many things that get done in hardware, it's clear how you can make a test case, a poster child, that makes it look good. And this has happened on so many things like SIMD acceleration, all the SSE stuff, where it's clear how you can make certain applications that work really great on those. Like the compression, decompression code that we've got that's in ET and some of our new stuff that John Paul did is perfect for SSE. It's one of those things that gets many, many times faster. But when you look at it in terms of, well, how much faster does the game get? You're looking at these small percentage numbers of increase. And that's even assuming that you restructure things to very carefully target that. And a lot of the multiprocessors, when you can't use them in really general fashions, are going to turn out like that, where you could say, oh, we can put all of our sound processing or all of our model generation or something over there. But it again comes back to Amdahl's law there, where if you're putting 20% of your code onto the accelerators, even if it becomes infinitely fast, that just didn't make your game that much quicker. And a lot of what makes games take up time is really nasty code. I mean, I look at hardware developers, when people sit out to do this research on here, they look at nice kernels of code, where they want something that they can analyze and look at where all the cycles go and say, well, we can make this lots faster by putting in an instruction that lets you do these 4 things at once. And that's easy to analyze, and it's nice to make a case for, and hardware's pretty straightforward to make it happen. But that's not what really makes the games go slow in most cases. And the analogy that I always use for the hardware people is, don't think about this as one of your tight video compression kernels. Think about the entire thing that you're trying to make faster as the GCC compiler with floats instead of chars. And it's just this awful, nasty thing where it's not nearly as, I mean, I can imagine it from the hardware designer standpoint of, oh, this isn't going to be nearly as rewarding and fun to work on. And they wind up going and doing another MMX or SSE or something that winds up accelerating a few small applications, but has utterly negligible impact on the game performance. And what's made games faster and faster over the years has been processors that make this ugly, nasty code, the kind of the spec-int type benchmarks go faster, where it's all these bigger caches, better branch prediction, stuff that makes everyday any core code that you compile through a C compiler go faster. And we've had an incredible run of that over the years, where they've pulled rabbits out of the hat over and over to keep making things faster. But it is pretty clear that we're probably seeing light at the end of the tunnel about how much faster we're going to be able to get out of all of that. And we saw a long stall in actual gigahertz ratings on processors. And while there's still a few more rabbits for them to pull out to go ahead and make the straight line code faster, it's not clear to me that we're going to see another order of magnitude there. And we've tracked through 3 orders of magnitude so far on the amazing advances that we've seen, and we might get another one. But after that, the only thing we've got to do is parallelism. And we have the one huge success story in parallelism, and that's the GPU, the graphics processing on there. And there's some special conditions that have made that work out so well. And the biggest aspect of it is that it's an inherently parallel problem. While it's not quite what's called an embarrassingly parallel problem, like ray tracing, where you can literally split something out over as many processors as you want with no communications between them, graphics is an easily parallelizable problem, where you can look at it and say, this triangle covers 200 pixels on the screen. Let's split this up over all sorts of different little processors and let them all go do their thing. And that's been, again, amazingly successful. We've delivered huge advances in performance, and it's noteworthy to say that the processors are clocking out at 4, 5, 6 times faster than the graphics processors or more, but the graphics processors, because they're able to exploit this parallelism, deliver all these huge benefits over that. And that's always something that's that people look at. It's like, well, why can't we get a graphics processor that runs at 3 gigahertz and will be that much faster? And it's fundamentally possible that they may get to that point where a lot of it comes down to hardware design decisions about Intel. They've got longer development cycles and more engineers to throw at some of this stuff to really go down and hand code, essentially. It's kind of the assembly language programming of hardware development to make these things run at these incredibly high clock rates, while stuff in the graphics world does tend to be done with more synthesis and more tool-based things because they've got faster development cycles and so on there. But there's sort of a debate going on right now about as you pull more graphics processing ability into the CPU, how that will translate into relative advantages. And I run the risk perhaps of looking like maybe a slightly over-the-hill elder statesman when I look at not being completely on board with that, where there's a lot of people that think that don't we always just want more flexibility in the graphics processing, and we still have this fairly specialized model that deals with things like vertexes and triangles before it gets down to fragment processing. And there is a lot of work that goes on into trying to do the same type of work on a processor with what extensions, like people originally thought MMX was going to be like this, or that SSE was going to replace the vertex processing. And it hasn't worked out like that, and I'm somewhat dubious about it working out that way in the coming generation. And this is what people are talking about in this generation and the next generation, where there were certainly a lot of factions that wanted the PS3 to have, maybe add another cell processor on and not have any graphics processor, to just be all software programming on there. And I think Sony totally dodged a bullet by not going that route. It's the type of thing that sounds like a good idea, and you can imagine the visionary new things that you're going to get as people get to experiment with that level of flexible processing power. But when it comes down to doing the things that 99% of the titles are going to want to do, it just doesn't quite work out as well. And I'm afraid that it may turn out like that for the next generation that wants to take on that type of stuff for pixel level tasks. And I think that there's a few things that can lead people astray and sort of down the wrong path on there, where again, when you look at the kernels of code, whether it's vertex processing or fragment processing, you can do those pretty well on the processors right now. And there's lots of times when the CPU could actually be a faster vertex processor than the graphics processor in there. And some graphics vendors make the really, really bad decision in my eyes to sometimes behind people's backs say, oh, we've got an extra processor free here, let's offload some of our vertex processing. It's like, bad graphics vendors. That's not a good thing to do from a developer's standpoint, because it adds so much more uncertainty and different levels of bugs for us and variability on that. But the truth is, in some cases, when you've got clear kernels like that, the CPU can win even today, and with various extensions, you could easily see that being a lot faster than some of the graphics processors on there. But what I think is going to kill them is the nasty part that nobody really wants to look at, which is things like rasterization and all the various weird fetching strides that you may get on things. And this is the type of stuff that if you just want to process pixels, you can go ahead and compile a fragment shader down and probably look pretty good on various processor analogs. But there's some trends that wind up making that look uncomfortably bad, where if you have, obviously, you cover the screen with one polygon, then you're all down to your kernel, and it's going to look great. But as polygon sizes, triangle sizes trend lower and lower, you get to the point where your kernel has to do all of this scheduling and combining of things. And modern graphics processors do a lot of stuff to combine fragments across multiple primitives, and even in some cases across various state changes on things. And this is what's necessary to maintain the pace of hardware advancement that we're seeing. And that type of stuff doesn't come over real great on processors there. And we've seen cases of this, like again making historical trends on there. There was a large set of development in graphics processors early on, the Power VR style of things, when you looked at it and said, if we put this really fast chunk of memory on here, we can do these kernel things really, really well. We can be much faster, we can offer anti-aliasing before everybody else, and all these various things. But when they weren't looking at the incredible expansion of both triangle rates, which hurts the binning processes, and then all the state changes and state that has to go in modifying or to running any fragment program, you wind up needing to buffer up all this incredible amount of stuff, and it kind of gets worse and worse. There's still cases that can be made. I mean, for just about any architectural decision, you can sort of produce an argument or a case that will make that look really good. But when you look at sort of where the trends in the industry are going, it becomes a little bit more questionable. And I try not to get in the game of making predictions about stuff, because the more I learn about things and the more I see things go through, I become almost more and more hesitant to say for sure like what direction the future is going to take. Because there's a lot of cases where when I look at something, I'm very good at looking one generation ahead, and I can say really clearly what I'd like to do with an order of magnitude more power on something. But when you start saying 2 orders of magnitude or 3 orders of magnitude, it's hard to kind of get your mind around realistically what you're going to be doing in those time frames. Like I've got some cases now where I might be looking at conceivably writing a fragment program that could have several thousand instructions, not for a game code, but for part of some content creation stuff where you might want to be doing this really complex blend in 4 different tiles and pulling them together and doing all sorts of stuff on here. Where I remember when I first saw fragment counts for some of the early processors, and they were saying like 4,000 instructions limit. I was like, okay, that's not really relevant. Great, it's nice to not have a limit that you're going to run into. But I was much more concerned at the time about getting good use of 8 or 16 instructions or something on there. So I don't think that I've ever really clearly had the visionary look of here's exactly what we want to do with 100 times more power. I mean, it's easy to come up with ways to throw the power away and to spend it. And in fact, it's an interesting exercise to kind of take different games and different data sets and say, if you were, say, just a programmer and you had no more media to throw at it on here, how would you try to make this game better with 10 times or 100 times more processing power? If you went and took, say, the original Doom game and said, all right, you don't get to make new media, you can just throw essentially infinite resources at it. How much better can you make the game? And there's a bunch of things that you can do. You wind up going ahead and getting good filtering. You do your 64x anti-aliasing, and maybe you figure out a way to go ahead and cast shadows from sprite billboards and things like that on there. And there's a few more things that you can crank up in the obvious linear ways where we've got monitors now with 2000 by something resolution, and that's great. You go ahead and so you run up to a couple megapixels that you're running there. 4x anti-aliasing is good. 16x is better. There are artifacts that do go away when you start cranking that up. There's a lot of things that we should do anti-aliasing wise as far as choosing our exact fragment pixel centers. Frame rates, we are really, really close to the most that you can use. I've done this twice now. I did this again recently, just this last year, when I started thinking, how much more benefit could we get by going to much higher frame rates? So I did some experiments and just took a simple part of our current game, and you run it at 30 hertz, you run it at 60 hertz, then you run it at 120 hertz and start blending the frames together, or 240 and blend the frames together. And it's enticing from a technical standpoint because especially on like the 360, you have to do this semi-tiled architecture when you're doing high resolution. So you sort of have to render 4 views anyways. It's enticing to think that maybe you go ahead and time jigger those and interlace them sort of like you do with interleaved television signals on there. But the honest truth is, it just doesn't wind up making a heck of a lot of difference. And I would go set up things trying to look for the difference where, yeah, if you've got fence posts along the side of a road and you strafe sideways at 60 miles an hour, it's nice to see some blur going on there when you go into these really high frame rates. But when you're just running around, not much of a difference. So there's a lot of these things where we are kind of close to points where it's just not beneficial to throw more at it. Frame rate, somewhere between 60 and 120 is just don't care anymore, even if you start using it for blending things together, except for when you're doing showpieces for it. If you've got the bumblebee with the buzzing wings and you want it to just magically get the blur correct and you don't want to use a special shader for doing that, then maybe you want hundreds and hundreds of frames per second and getting it all filtered together. But you have to contrive cases for that. It's not things that just happen when you're building a game and this just gets better. Resolution-wise, we are essentially already at that point right now where most movies, at least until recently, weren't rendered when they were doing CG scenes at resolutions as high as our monitors today. Lots of old movies, Pixar stuff, was rendered at resolutions that were like 1K or less. Very, very good filtering, lots of samples per pixel, but you still weren't winding up with that high of an output resolution, and then it would be kind of stretched up with a filter and burned to film. So the desktops that we've got right now with 2K resolution on an LCD, probably more than sufficient, and in fact, huge amounts of that are wasted. Most people that have big desktops have had the case where you're staring at your screen there and you're wiggling the mouse cursor around and you're totally not seeing it, even though that's 256 pixels sliding around on the screen. It's making no impact on your optic nerve there if it's not in the foveal region that you're really concentrating on. So if anything, we're already throwing away huge amounts of resources. And I've mentioned this before where if we had the ability to really target exactly what people are looking at with one of the retinal eye tracking systems or direct retinal scanning, we're throwing out more pixels than people have discretely discernible dots in their eye. That is something that you could have if you had the right processing power to generate those. That is simulate reality level. And it's amazing how much work we do in graphics right now that winds up being completely wasted, where you wind up spending all this time doing some 16-sampled filtered shadow that's up in the corner where it's already pretty dark and nobody can see or care at all. But unfortunately, people try this commonly where you try to make a focus area on the game and spend less time in other places. And it doesn't really work out because people's eyes are always roving around the screens and you really do need to kind of generate everything until you can tell exactly where people are looking and then you can generate just what they're looking at. So resolution, if anything, we're already sort of overkill on there. There is a lot of benefit to be gained by going to better sampling. And that is probably the largest thing that distinguishes production quality offline rendering from video games right now. In a lot of cases now, video games may have much better texture resources and more interesting models, but some of the stuff that's rendered for TV, say with offline rendering, might even be much cruder in the model specification and the media that goes into it, but they can throw a lot of samples at things and get rid of almost all aliasing. But I do recognize that that is something that, from a gameplay perspective, is not incredibly hugely important. It's the type of thing that if somebody's looking at something as a passive observer, the quality of fidelity at that level might be somewhat more important, but when you're playing the game, a lot of the stuff, again, not that incredibly important. I look back to, I can make points about aliasing and things that I'd like to see in hardware with modified sampling centers and different stuff that could improve this, but I do recognize that in the grand scheme of things, it's not all that important. I remember early on when Wolfenstein and Doom were the big games, I would talk to some academic people and they were just appalled. I mean, just like mouth open, appalled at how anyone could possibly look at all that aliasing. And That was the thing that would stand out to them, that this game has no filtering, no anti-aliasing, it's awful. But that wasn't, that wasn't the point. That wasn't what people were getting excited about. It was the experience that they had in there, and people were willing to look past even that level of incredibly crude graphics and get a very positive experience out of it. So today, when I wind up looking at some of these things, that being honest with myself, they're really nitpicky, and I make, at this point, we're trying not to let things that aren't going to have really significant effects on the game drive any development decisions, where there's all sorts of graphics technologies that are interesting to experiment with, and I've done dozens of little experiments in the last couple of years, and most of these things wind up coming back and saying, not that big of a deal. Probably not worth structuring, making a change in the way our graphics is designed or the way we do our content creation, things like that for. There are some changes that we'll probably wind up making in the future. Normal maps are probably a temporary aberration, based on sort of direct hardware rendering, where there's a lot of reasons why we probably will prefer height maps in the future, but nothing compelling enough at this moment to make me want to change our development direction for this project on there. So, in many ways, we're sort of seeing I would say we're probably past, with this generation of consoles and PCs, I would say we've kind of reached peak graphics return, where we might still have a whole nother 50% of benefit to be gained going forward on that, but they're probably not going to be as huge of gains as we get, as we got in the past. And I think that there's, again, good analogies looking towards the movie industry, where there's lots of movies coming out right now, animated movies that have essentially equally good graphics. And you can look at all of these, and if I wanted to sit down there and pick apart scenes, I could critique a particular shader someone's using, or maybe have some specific comment about why this is more technically advanced than some other movie, but it's way to the point of diminishing returns there. It does have to come down to doing good things with these capabilities that you've got now and managing the development cycle. I mean, we can look at, recently I watched, comparison-wise, like Pixar's Cars and then Chicken Little, and they're essentially equally good graphically on there, but one's a better movie than the other. And games are going to be, there's going to be value for at least one more generation in having the best high-tech graphics, being able to do things that knock people's socks off. But increasingly, that's going to come from money in the development budget and what you do with content rather than what you do with technology. Because we're already past the point where if somebody came, just went and developed something that was absolutely the optimal, best thing you could do on a particular platform, and it was twice as good as anything that I could do, and they didn't have artists that were as good as the team that we've got it in, it could be twice as good as my work and still look like crap compared to our stuff. Because it really is the content creation side on there. Now, there's still leverage to be gained, but as we look another generation past this, the technology will be, as far as what you produce visually-wise, fairly deprecated on that. Now, what's still going to have a really big important advantage is how the technology feeds into the development process. And that's the real sort of core challenge as we go forward, in that game development is, it's hard and getting harder as we start taking on all of these different things. If we were satisfied with just doing the same things that we did in the past and just crank up the numbers, so we go higher resolution, more frame rate, more monsters on there, just more of the same, then that would be great. It wouldn't be that challenging. We could ride some of these curves and get some benefits from it. But we do have this desire to go ahead and say, what was impossible before? Let's go ahead and try it now. And that is what leads to year-long slips in game development, when you say it's like, well, maybe that was a little bit more challenging than we thought to try and get all this to work out, or worse, maybe it turned out to be a bad idea. Those type of really serious game development challenges on there, especially on the programming side, are big deals. I mean, we're talking tens of millions of dollars for game development budgets now, and a lot of it does come down to the programming is still the side that can be least managed, where content, whether it's art or models or sounds, it has the nice discrete nature to it where you know that if somebody goes and makes a new monster sound over there, it's not going to break the sound that you did a week ago. And that's unfortunately just not the case with programming. As the projects have gotten more and more complicated, you need more and more programmers. It was great in the old days where our games were essentially done by me and an assistant programmer. That is the most effective way that you can wind up programming something. You have sort of the lead surgeon model and an assistant to work on that. And then, I mean, this even goes back to people that have read it, Fred Brooks' book, The Mythical Man Month. This was this book written in 1970, something about IBM programming development. And it's a wonderful book to read when you read about these problems that people were having 30-something years ago on mainframes. And you can look at that and say, oh, that happens in game development today, and all this, the same types of issues there. But the problem with programming is that the tasks that we assign to ourselves are getting more and more complicated. Programming is not an evenly divisible challenge where you can't just say, we're 50% behind schedule, let's double the number of people on it. That's why the book was called The Mythical Man Month. The thought that you could go ahead and say, well, this is going to take 50 man months. We want to get done really fast, so let's put 50 people on it and get it done next month. Now, that's clearly a ridiculous case, but it's still, people think about it in a lesser sense that, well, we're falling behind schedule, let's hire a couple more programmers. And there's a dangerous line there where bringing on more resources can help when the problems are separable. But when you start trying to bring on more resources to help the person that's behind on a single task that they're doing, that way usually does lead towards even worse schedule slippages. And the challenge is that, especially for systems level programming, like what we do with game development, all the tools in the world aren't giving us the benefits, at least comparable to the challenges that we're facing, where we've seen this 1000x increase in our processing power, but the development tools that we've got to go with things, I mean, I love the tools that we've got today, and Visual Studio and all the various VTune and things like this that help us do our development job. But honestly, if I had to look at it and say, how much longer would it take me to do the same thing that I'm doing now if I was working with Notepad and a command line compiler and GDB? It'd be several times slower, but it wouldn't be 10 times slower. So I mean, we don't have even a single order of magnitude benefit that we've gained from software technology for the development process. I mean, I do think there was at least an order of magnitude, just the step going from assembly language to C. But the step of going from C to C++ and working with object frameworks and working with the very latest development environments and modern management methods, whatever, I think that's less than one order of magnitude all put together on that. While people that do certain types of things like web-based applications and form-based applications, they get larger benefits than that from the computer-aided development tools. But game development, at least the way id does it as a systems level task, where we're trying to improve the fundamental things that we're doing, is still very much a low-level, work with low-level code, try it out, debug it, and run through all of that. And I don't see any silver bullets on the horizon coming there. And in fact, I've got all these books that I get about managing software development and software quality, and because I want to improve all of these things. I want software to be better. I want it to get done in a faster time. I want it to be higher quality, have less defects, cause less problems for people. But I read a bunch of these books, and sometimes I realize I've read 200 pages and they haven't told me a damn thing. They're talking about process management, management methods, and I look through all this and say, none of this is going to make you write really good code. And there's sort of related to that, on my Armadillo Aerospace hat on, we're dealing with the FAA for all of our flight safety stuff, for the stuff that we're going to be flying in front of a crowd at the X-Prize Cup in October. So we're going through all of this development stuff with them about assessing reliability and all that, and they want to assess the reliability of the software that controls all of that. So I say, well, here's the source code. Here is what I've written. Here's what controls the rocket. Please, code review it. Tell me anything that you think looks dubious. Tell me anything that you think could be better, that might be a dodgy practice, that you've seen work better in other, for other companies doing things like this. And they won't touch it. They say, we don't want to look at your code. We're not qualified to look at your code. We just want to hear about your process for how you're going to produce good code. And there's some merit to what they say on there. I mean, there is a value to process, but product at the end is what's really important. And a perfect process can still let bad product come out the end. The whole analogy of you can have clean pipes and still get dirty water out the end, and what you really want to be testing is the water rather than the pipes. And I'm still, this is one of the things that I get this little bug to try and go follow this up at least once per project, but I never wind up being able to really follow through on it to try and implement some quality initiatives in our different stuff, because it always winds up being, well, we're behind schedule always. We need to get the next thing done. Let's concentrate on the stuff that we need to get done right now. And that might be short-sighted of me. I mean, it's completely possible that if we got all of our programmers together and said, well, let's start getting a little bit more rigorous about some of this process stuff, it might be better for us. But I have a hard time actually seeing it happen because we just have too much pressure for the other things on there. So initiatives on quality just tend to be a time, okay, I get the bug, let's go review a bunch of my code, look for problems, start taking notes on what were the last 3 things that caused a crash and error related to any of the code. Is that endemic of anything that might be showing up elsewhere in the code? What can I do to be improving that? But it's a hard, grueling business trying to get large, complicated software development stuff done. And there's all the the classic things in the game industry about the death marches and trying to push everything out for beta. Id Software at least has the freedom to be able to say it's done when it's done. Most development studios I know don't really have that luxury, and a lot of times they're told when it's going to be done because they're going to ship in this quarter and you just better make the best of it, which is an impossible situation to put people in. I mean, I know certainly developers are somewhat to blame by having unrealistic expectations for their development times, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone, where somebody asks you how long. I mean, it used to be a joke at id when somebody would say, how long will something take? And it was 2 weeks, because a programmer thinks they can get anything done in 2 weeks. I mean, 2 weeks is 14 days that you stayed up. You could just get anything done in that time frame. But of course, it doesn't actually work out like that. And while in any of the projects that I've been involved in or that I've worked on, I've never failed at any of them, but I've never been on time either. And even with all the experience that I've got, that says something fairly damning about the work that we do, and it's pretty common. It's really rare to run into a programmer that can actually say it's going to take this long and get something done in that time frame, unless it's something that they've just done before. And in our defense, I would say that, well, we are trying to do new and different things, and there's an aspect of research and not just engineering to this. We are trying to do something that we haven't done before, and you can't predict the unknown with complete certainty like that. But still, there's probably something we could be doing better at that. And my theory is that programmers always think about things in terms of uninterrupted time, where it'll take 3 days if I sat down and put 30 hours into it, but that's not counting the time when somebody came in to talk with you or you answered email, or probably not even counting your bathroom breaks on there. But it takes, I wish programmers could be better at estimating that, and I'm as guilty as anyone about that. At one point early on in id, I was taking as a point of pride that we were missing our schedules by 50%, while lots of competitors were missing it by 100%. And I was legitimately proud of that. But we've probably slipped past the 50% scheduling on our current stuff as things remain really challenging there. And related to the research and the development implementation stuff, it wouldn't be very interesting if we were just doing the known things. If you were just sitting there and throwing together the 50th web page like you've done before, if game development was just like that, it wouldn't be very exciting to be in. There is that element of research that makes it enticing. And while my primary motivation has always been as an engineer, I want to do things that people use. I want to produce something that provides value to people. There are all of these other little motivations that go together with that, where there is the motivation of the scholar, the person that wants to know the breadth of the field and know all the papers that have been published about this, and have this broad field of knowing what you can pick and choose from, in the sense of the scope of the boundaries of the knowledge, so you know where the unknowns are and you know where the solutions are. There's an attraction to that, about wanting to be the person that has the subscriptions to all the journals and knows everything that's going on and what research was done in the last 10 years and what everybody's working on. And there's the appeal of the scientist, where you really do want to do real research, where you want to do something and say, nobody's really addressed this exact problem. I have an inkling of how the solution might be for this. Let's start exploring this. But then you look at that and say, I could easily imagine, I run into problems like this sometimes where I'm saying, that's kind of interesting. I could spend a year working on this, and I could write a SIGGRAPH paper or something, and at the end of it, perhaps derive some enjoyment from that, but it wouldn't be the same satisfaction that I get from doing products that everybody plays and enjoys and has fun with. I participate in that. I peer review things for SIGGRAPH, and I like to have my small toe in having some part in the academic process and peer review and sort of advancing the state of knowledge there. But I do come back to the appeal of the engineer on there. And every once in a while, there's the appeal of the tinkerer, where you get the sense that if there weren't any of this pressure to produce product and to deliver things on schedule there, a lot of times it's just, it'd be fun to go and learn about all the different little things, play with graphics technology, and it'd be fun to be like in the demo scene. You just like write little demos like that, or be a random Linux hacker or something. But it does come back to, I like to engineer things. I want to build things and improve the quality of the products and provide real value. So that, going forward on that, I don't see any massive changes in what we're doing and the way we're going to go about doing it. It is the great thing about a mature industry, is there are all of these forces that conspire together to make things better, where it's great that we've got multiple processor vendors, multiple development environments, multiple operating systems, multiple hardware platforms at every level. All of this is really good and healthy, and it's what kind of makes all of these things work together. While we're not getting silver bullets, but we get a whole lot of really small benefits that do wind up helping us from generation to generation. And I think that on the large-scale stuff, our next title, we certainly expect it to go be a blockbuster and do some things that people have never seen before, certainly never seen from it before. We are branching out in some different directions. We do expect to have some graphics that are breathtaking and awe-inspiring, that can hook people in and make them take a look at it and want to experience and play the game on there. But it's also interesting then to go take the big U-turn and get away from the super high-end stuff and look at interesting challenges and design choices in all sorts of other platforms, where in the time that we've been working on this new unannounced project that's top of the line, next gen, this and that, we've done 3 cell phone products in that same time frame, and we're going to get a couple more done, I'm sure, before we wind up having this high-end product out. And on the one hand, it's really retro, it's small scale, you're dealing with really tiny things compared to the high-end stuff. But there is an aspect that we've totally lost in the high-end development, and that's this evolutionary cycle, where I always considered it one of id Software's real strengths, that the company was founded by people working on monthly subscription software for soft disk publishing, where we were making a game every month and then every 2 months, because we learned so much about how to get an idea, implement it, try it out, test it, evaluate what people got out of it, and then go back and take what we learned and make the changes on there and follow through. With the high-end games now, when it's taking 3 years, 4 years, longer in some cases, you wind up with people at the end of the project that weren't even there at the beginning, that did not learn the entire cycle of lessons through there, and it's rare to have half your staff that's been through one complete development cycle on a modern high-end game. And that is a shame, because there are things that you will only learn by being at a project from beginning to end and being involved in all those decisions. There's a lot of people in the game industry that can hop around from company to company and be like, I was there for starting this project and finishing this project, but not have as much experience as you might think they would have given the years that they've been in the industry. So the small-scale platform stuff has been really pretty fun. The cell phone game development, there's a unique character to it where, as a hardware platform, it's pretty neat. They're small little platforms, they've got good displays, they've got decent little processors. API-wise, it's not a lot of fun because you're working through this stuff. The people that wrote the APIs and implemented them fundamentally did not care about games. They were given a spec and it was sent off to probably some shop in India and they implemented the spec. So it's not the type of thing where there's deep involvement from that side, and a lot of things are horribly screwed up. But it's still an interesting platform to work on, and you've got the whole range of specifications from, it's even broader than the PC space. You've got well over an order of magnitude, probably a factor of 50 between what people would consider a high-end and a low-end phone in terms of capabilities. And that's evolving real fast. Just recently, I started taking a look at the Nintendo DS as a possible target for moving over some of our cell phone stuff. And it's really kind of neat looking at that, where power-wise, there's a bunch of cell phones that are actually more powerful than that, although we can't target those because we also have to support the lower-end stuff. But I look at that and say, this would have been such a cool environment to kind of learn programming and game development on. I do tell people now that if you want to learn, if you're not a professional programmer, programming something on the cell phone might be a really good way to start, because you can just do it in Java and you don't have to learn DX9, whatever, just get something up on the screen. It's really simple and confined, which, when I look back to how I learned programming on an Apple II, there was a lot of benefit to being able to go and writing the couple-page program and just seeing some stuff happen on the screen, which you really don't get in classic PC development nowadays. But the little DS on there is pretty cool in that it's a small, confined platform like that, but you still get to bit twiddle. You get to go in and say, this bit on this hardware register does this bit controls, obviously, this mucks in the hardware. And there's that sense of learning which most people are insulated from in modern development. And I think a lot of young programmers will really enjoy that type of stuff, to go in and kind of get your fingers a little bit dirtier down at the hardware level. And that's something that, on a PC, you are so divorced from that. You may be programming in a language which is touching an API, which is going through a hardware abstraction level, which is going through some OSQ, which finally winds up setting a bit on the hardware someplace. It's kind of neat to be able to say, write this location, and the LCD screen goes off because you just muxed it over to someplace else. So I don't get to spend too much time on these types of things, but it is a nice value as a technical director, where with the cell phone development, I've been able to go and spend a few weekends where I go and I write something, I make a proof of concept thing on it, and then the guys at Fountainhead can go take that and really run with it. And we've gotten really good accolades from Doom RPG and Works and Elves, and we have a couple people over there with the cell phones in the display hall. If you haven't seen them, it's worth taking a look at. I'm pretty proud of the games there. We've got another sequel coming out, not too distant future on that, but. It would probably go similarly with Nintendo stuff, where I might go and take one of my little retreats where I lock myself into a hotel room with a development system, and a week later come out with a little game engine for it that somebody can then take and go develop from that. And that's a pretty good use of my time on there, because it would be appealing in some ways to go spend a month on some of this stuff, but I just can't justify it. I mean, the important time that I have to spend is on the mainstream id projects. So I steal little bits of time to go work on some of these other things, which I do have high hopes for possibly blossoming into more important projects. While the upcoming id game is our first big title that's a real new project for id since Quake. Works and Elves on the cell phone is actually really our first new title since Quake, and it may wind up migrating to other platforms, and it might even graduate to a larger platform at some place, which would be pretty neat. And I do think that type of development has a lot of potential for people, because breaking in at the top of the food chain in the next-gen consoles is conservative market, and it's tough. And there was kind of a funny conversation I had with some of the people at some of the cell phone teams, where they were talking to some developer in Europe about things. And the developer was like, so you guys all used to do PC games and you moved to doing cell phone games. And it's like, we're doing cell phone games, but we really want to go to PC games, making the trek that way. But being able to go in and do 5 games in the space of the time that you would do one PC game, you may have the freedom to actually try a couple crazy ideas that don't work out. And this creeping conservatism really is a problem, and even when I take these active steps to address it, when I made this big point about I want to be able to stretch out and do some different things rather than just doing yet another first-person shooter using yet another id license on here, So I looked at the cell phone stuff, and I came up with this list of a half dozen different things that I thought would be good games, that would be things that would play well on the platform, that would take advantage of the good characteristics and sidestep the limits on there. But the first thing out the gate that we did, it was Doom RPG, turned out to be really good, selling really well, critics like it, game players like it. So do we go and do the 5 other things that I thought might be good? No, we go and take that engine and we evolve it and we polish it and we make better games with it. But that's the same path that we already took on the PC, where we fiddled around a lot at the early days with our side-scrollers, but once we kind of hit the first-person shooter, that's defined it on the high-end space since then. And it might be we're already stuck with this, where the kind of little turn-based axial 3D stuff that I've done on the cell phone, that may wind up defining what we do on the cell phone platform, and maybe I need to jump to some completely different platform to make yet another stab in a different direction. So it's tough, where people talk about, it's almost a pet peeve of mine, where you get some people in the community that go on about independent game development and and how everything is sequels and it's all the same, and it's I don't have a whole lot of sympathy for that position. While there's some truth to it, where it is hard to get into the game industry, it's hard to get a developer to give you $10 million. That only makes sense. There is going to be an element of, they want a good sense that it's not this wild, crazy thing. And even if you think you've got the best idea in the world, complaining that somebody's not giving you millions and millions of dollars to develop it isn't really fair to the industry. I mean, there are things to be concerned about with kind of ossification in the industry, but there are opportunities for people to do innovative things. I've always thought that the mod development has been a very positive way for people to show their ideas without having to spend millions and millions of dollars. I got my 1 hour warning already a little while ago, but there's a bunch more things that I still kind of want to say here. I'll probably be here to take questions as long as anybody wants to answer them, but wants to hear me answer them. But kind of related to that, I want to segue a little bit off of that from mod development, things like that, related to the software quality issue. Last year we released open source the Quake 3 code on there, and there were a couple interesting things that happened. We had 2 exploits that people found based on the source code that they were able to do, that they were able to make exploits based on from looking at the source code in there. And that's always the worry that people have when you talk about releasing the source code as well. It's going to let people cheat in these different ways. And there's real truth to that. It does cause problems there. In talking about software quality there, it's very worthwhile to look at this and realize that I tried real hard in the Quake 3 development. I was thinking about security because I knew it was our multiplayer-focused game. I wanted the game to be robust and reliable on there. And in general, we did a good job with that. When people got the source code, they were able to pick through it, and they found a couple things. And the 2 things that they found were both things that were added after the game was released. It was in point releases and expansion packs and things like that. And that's something that I think kind of poignantly shows up how fragile software development is. Where even if you start off with a great plan and you've done a good rigorous implementation and it's well tested and you've got a good product here, all it takes is one person making a quick change to not think something through all the way, and it's then wide open. It's not like a failure in an analog system where something gets a little bit worse. It's a digital failure. If there's a hole, everything is wide open there. And that's saddening to think about that. And if anything, I've been surprised that the modern internet-connected world hasn't caused more problems, where we've got millions of rooted computers, and all people wind up doing with them are sending spam and doing denial of service attacks and things on there, which it's kind of funny when you think about it. Everybody goes on about privacy, and I better encrypt all of my emails so nobody reads this or anything. And we've got millions of people that are utterly compromised, and to a large extent, nobody really cares. I mean, it's not like they're digging through and blackmailing you with whatever you had in your email. But still, it's disquieting that all of these computers have been rendered wide open by software flaws, and most of these aren't going away. And there are things that could be done industry-wide if we were willing to put up with performance losses or feature losses in a lot of things. But so far, the user community does not seem to be willing to put up with that. Benchmarks still rule the day on a lot of buying decisions. It's hard to measure security, and people look at the things that are nicely measurable there. And I mean, there's stuff like, there's a good call for writing an operating system even in something like Java that can't have a buffer overrun. And people look at that, oh, it'll be 4 times slower, maybe 2 times slower if you're optimistic about some things. But there's so much that we do at home. My computer at home, I mostly just use for email and web browsing, and that could be 1/10 the speed of the current modern computers. I mean, I wouldn't want my development system to be cut down like that, but there's a whole lot of work that people do that could be much, much more secure. But I did want to take a little bit of a straw poll here, just amongst the audience, in regards to the open sourcing of the code, and it's been something that I've been pushing on for, for all this time for what I think are a lot of good reasons, in that I do look at it as a programmer. I mean, my motivation is mostly towards looking back to 14-year-old John Carmack would have been so happy if the source code for all of his favorite games were released and he could go play around with them. And that's kind of what I look at, is I'm making that possible. And I think there's other benefits of, I'm real happy when I see somebody doing academic research using one of the engines as a base, citing it in papers, doing the experiments. It does become the opportunity of being a super mod as far as making a resume for getting a job or pitching a title in the industry. It's a little disappointing, although not real surprising. Nobody did ever sort of take the gamble and do a GPL commercial release title. It would be a budget title, obviously, with dated technology. But we did get people that came up and wanted to pay more money just to be able to keep the closed source nature of it, which I've always thought was a little bit, it's a little bit funny, where here you've got the situation of, we took this incredibly valuable stuff that we did and made it freely available, while you've got the developers that are like, oh, but this 2% that I just did to change in here, that's top secret. We can't let that out. But if we made the option open, if they want to come and pay for it, they can get the license and keep everything proprietary on there. And another benefit that I think is really good is that the games that we put out there will now never die. You see Doom and Quake show up on everything with a processor, and I think that's great. Anything that you've got a C compiler running on, people will compile Doom. If it's got an FPU, they'll compile Quake, and this is good. But the downsides are, when we had the original release of Doom and Wolfenstein on there was seen as a purely positive thing. Everybody was just really thrilled about it. But there was a pretty strong backlash when I released the Quake 1 source code, because there was still an active community of players that were playing the game seriously, and they cared about the competition, and releasing the source code does result in more exploits. And that's just the bottom line. I mean, while one of the mantras of the open source crowd is that there's no security through obscurity, and in a strictly theoretical sense, that's true, but that's not true in the real world. And we have this perfect example here. There were 2 faults in Quake 3 that could have been exploited for a long time that weren't, just because they were obscure. Yes, if the government of a foreign nation decided they must break the code, they could disassemble everything forward and find it. But in practical matters, that's not the attack which the theoretical people generally think about things like that. What does an opponent with infinite resources, like what entries do they have on there, and what can you rely on to secure against there? But that's not the real world. And there were problems with Quake. With Quake 2, I didn't hear much back from anybody. With Quake 3, released last year, I haven't really heard much one way or the other about it. I do think that there's, in general, somewhat of a slackening in the mod community because of the state of the games and the quality required to do the total conversions that people used to like to do on things. But it's still something that people get some benefit from. But if anybody would be the people that would kind of call out against this from the competitive nature on it, it would probably be the people here. So I'd like to see an honest show of hands about the people that that on one hand think that it's a good thing, or think that either it should have been delayed longer, it's something that, like the source code, it's great to have it out, but you should only put it out when the game is completely deprecated and nobody really cares anymore. So how many people here, and I'm sure there are some, so no need to be really shy and not want to stick your hand up on here, but how many people think that it was probably a bad thing to release the source code to Quake 3 at this point last year? Because it was a big topic of debate about, would we wait another year, was it good enough at this point, or could we have done it sooner? So I mean, how many people thought that was an issue. Nobody was pissed off at some cheater playing with them. Okay, we got one person there that probably had a bad cheating experience. That's it? Okay, I'm happy there. That's that makes sense. So I will go ahead and start taking questions now. We're probably eating into about half the time allotted, but I don't think they've got anything scheduled immediately after, so I can probably carry on for a while after. So Marty's going to walk around with the microphone so I can hear everyone.
I'm going to start over here, so if you just raise your hand if you have a question on this side, and then I'll come over here and you can raise it, just so you don't have to keep your hand up the whole time.
With Doom 3 and so on, the demo support for it was pretty limited, and especially, I know you guys didn't develop Quake 4, but the demo system for Quake 4 is very, very, very limited. Like, there were some improvements, but you could not get the game to draw net demos lower than what it actually was, so you couldn't scale. And you mentioned games as a showpiece, and I was wondering if in your future games you intended to put a little bit more demo support and so on, I guess.
Okay, certainly there was a lot of debate internally about exactly how we go about supporting that. And as you can imagine, my wife does all the machinima stuff that she's known for, so there was pressure that we should do a good job at this. But this was one of the things that didn't work out really as we wanted in the Doom 3 development cycle, where this was an early strategic mistake that I made, where at the start of Doom 3, we decided that it was going to be reasonably limited multiplayer. We knew it was going to be aggressive on hardware. We weren't going to be doing a 16-player game, so we were looking at 4-player support on there as the primary support. And knowing some of the other problems that games have, things that are traditionally troublesome like save games, I thought that it would be a good idea to try setting the game up as a synchronous gameplay execution and being able to use the same basic synchronous nature both for save games, for demo recording, and also for networking. If it had worked out, it would have been a good idea. It would have avoided a lot of problems. It would have made something fairly robust. But it didn't work out as we desired on there. We had consistency problems, and the load games were too slow. We had kind of a neat interface there where you could play back your save game from the beginning, which was neat for a while, but if you'd been playing for 45 minutes in there and it took 5 minutes to scroll back up to, even on fast forward, it wasn't really viable. So that's a great example of something that was probably worth trying, but turned out to be a bad idea. Once we kind of came to grips with the fact that that wasn't going to be our all-in-one solution for all of this, we sort of had to make some hack directions on there. Let's make a different direction for networking and demos. And it wasn't something where we sat at the beginning and said, let's do a really good job at this. It was, we're halfway through our development schedule, and this was a wrong direction. It's a dead end. We need to get something going. So it is interesting with the demo selection stuff on there where there's a chance, and you won't want to hear this, but there's a chance that there's a very good chance that the direction things are going is just direct video capture rather than any kind of algorithmic replay. There's a lot of reasons why that works out to be a strong thing from a development standpoint, because demo recording and playback is one of those things that needs to be maintained, that always breaks. If you don't touch demo coding for 6 months, it doesn't work. It's just a guarantee. If you've gone and done any other game development stuff, your demos will have broken. And I think that the demos wind up, they're getting so large with all the effects going on there. It's not even that you can say, in the early days, you could have a tiny little demo download, and it's cool to show people this because it was small. If you're sending it over a modem, that's a great thing. But I honestly think that the direction things are tending towards is more video production based. That's at least my current thinking.
Okay.
First off, I just want to say, in relation to the release of the source code, it is a large testament to you and id Software that you pounced on those exploits so quickly. I can think of many other companies that, a 5-6-year-old game, some bug comes out, they're not going to bother with it, so I want to thank you about that. Based on your recent experiences with, I'll dare to use this phrase, simpler environments, and what you've been saying about the finger's reach of absolute realism, quote unquote, I believe you made statements before about more demand for abstraction and more creative use of artwork and display graphics in future games. Do you see that as affecting your own work lately, or will the push in it not always, but to the foreseeable future, be realism?
Well, I don't think that realism is necessarily the end-all goal. Talking about the movies on there, I think that we're at, for animated movies, I think that they're at a wonderful point where they can do spectacular animated movies with cuddly characters and all of this, and it's absolutely as good as they need to be. Photorealistic, cuddly character. But when they start doing people in there, it doesn't look nearly as good. It still has all the problems with the sort of zombie state on things. And in that case, I think that's a very smart thing, where when directors decide and say, okay, we can do something that is essentially photorealistic and completely believable if we restrict ourselves in a certain way, but you've got a much more challenging problem which you might not solve correctly if you choose to go with people. And honestly, that's a little bit of a worry for me right now because our next game has lots of people in it, and we're working hard on the problem there. But for years, my mantra's been zombies and demons. People have no context to compare them to. That's been one of the cornerstones of in-software strategic success. So people and photorealism. Actually, the problem now is not so much graphics. We know how to do photorealistic graphics. The problem really is in the simulation and how you get the data to it. Now, that becomes this tight collaboration between people that have artistic sense and the people that produce the tools and technologies that they work with. And I do think that graphics programmer is going to be mutating much more into the sort of Pixar technical director model, where you're working with people crafting uses of more stable tools into something that kind of gets their vision out, and important stuff will be going on in tools. The actual rendering type of things, I don't need that much input from the artist. I mean, there'll be a few things that you can then take and say, well, we can try out all these new rendering technologies based on existing stuff. And it was a huge change when we went from the Quake 3 model of light maps and smooth shaded stuff to the Doom 3 model of having normal maps and discrete lights. That was a big traumatic change. We're not going through any more similar traumatic changes like that in this generation, and there are not going to be any really drastic ones going forward unless we have a massive sea change in rendering technology, which I can imagine some stuff going on with. There's a raycast voxel technology that I would love to look into more, especially now as I look at megatexturing entire worlds, and you're like, well, a voxelized technology would be the megatexture or the megageometry equivalent of all of that. And there'd be cool stuff there, but I look at all the forces aligned with triangle rasterization going forward there, that it seems unlikely. And maybe that's the type of killer app that makes one of these more generalized processor cell type things work out. I mean, who knows? But for now, I think it's the safe bet, smart money is on spending more and more time to enable the artists to use the tools that they're working with to create better art. And it's not so much the technology showing itself, it's the technology enabling the artist to do somewhat better things. And we've seen this clearly with each generation, where you do need better and better artists as you remove the restrictions, where there were whole classes of talented people that might have been really good at pixel art, 256 color art, or even EGA art or something like that, that did not translate into the next steps as you start going to modeling and high resolution textures. And you see some people sort of hit their personal talent limits that the technology may be moving past. So you do start really caring about getting absolutely kick-ass artists that are going to really be able to shine on there, because you may be at a point where before we had low limits and people would just bump up against that. And now that we've moved the bar so far back on what we can do in the game engines, we get lots of people that they can bound around right up to their limits on there. We still want the people that are pushing up against it, that are doing the best thing possible in the kind of canvas that we give to them.
Since you mentioned the home consoles like the 360 and the PS3 as well as the Nintendo DS, I was wondering if you had had a chance to play around with a Nintendo Wii, and what you thought of the controller as well as maybe the system in general.
No, I actually have had no interaction whatsoever with Nintendo on any of the next-gen development stuff. I mean, id Software has not historically had close ties with Nintendo. I mean, the one project that we did with them internally years ago, we didn't like the experience, and since then we've only worked through third parties dealing with them. So we're not one of the real preferred developers that they come to with things. You know, if I do DS stuff, it's probably not going to be directly through Nintendo. It probably wind up being through EA or somebody.
John, what's your personal opinion of the AMD and ATI merger?
You know, it sort of came as a little bit of a blindside to me, where I don't follow necessarily all the business rumor sites and things like that. So I heard the couple weeks of rumors and then the announcement, hey, it's a done deal. And I have not formulated a strong opinion on that. I'm really interested to hear the new strategic briefings that, you know, when they come around next and give us the roadmap of where they're going. I'm interested in hearing what the plans are. My first blush reaction would be that I was very happy with the graphics industry having 2 strong independent players, and I probably would have been a little happier with 3. I mean, when we had 20, it was clearly a bad thing. When it all shuffled down and we were left with a few strong players, I think that's really good for the industry. 2 might be a tiny bit marginal on there, and if it comes down to really sort of one and a captive player, that's probably not the best thing for the market, but I certainly understand AMD's motivation for wanting to do that. As the pace of, you know, we're getting more density increases on chips, we need to throw transistors at it, if they have the choice of throwing more PC cores on there or GPU stuff on there, it's probably going to be better benefit for the consumers to get GPUs on there because of all the, you know, all the issues that I talked about on developing use for multiple cores. So I see the pull for it, but I have reservations about it. As far as, it's probably good for them together, but whether it's good for the entire industry and consumers, I'm a little less sure about.